Welcome to Life Stories, where we share heartwarming tales of kindness, resilience, and transformation. Today's story follows Jake, a humble mechanic whose simple act of helping a stranded motorist on a rainy evening leads to a life-changing opportunity. What began as a gesture of compassion turns into an incredible journey of hope, gratitude, and second chances. Join us as we explore how one small act of kindness created ripples that transformed lives in ways no one could have imagined. Subscribe to Life Stories to begin today's inspiring tale of generosity and the unexpected paths it can open. The rain was relentless that evening, a steady downpour that seemed to blur the edges of the world. Jake tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his truck's wipers struggling against the sheets of water. It was another long day at the garage, hours spent bent over engines and covered in grease. He was tired, his back aching, but the familiar drive home offered a small comfort. Springfield was quiet on rainy nights like this. Most people stayed indoors, the streets deserted except for the occasional car splashing through puddles. Jake didn't mind the solitude. He'd always been the kind of man who found peace in the quiet moments when he could let his thoughts drift. As he turned onto the stretch of road leading out of town, his headlights illuminated a strange sight ahead. A car was pulled over to the side, hazard lights flashing against the murky darkness. Standing next to it was a woman, her coat pulled tightly around her, looking utterly defeated by the rain. Jake's first instinct was to keep driving. He was tired. The rain was miserable, and helping would only mean more time before he could finally get home. But something made him slow down. He wasn't the kind of man to ignore someone in need, no matter how exhausted he was. Pulling his truck to the shoulder, Jake stepped out into the rain. The cold droplets soaked through his jacket almost immediately, but he hardly noticed. He approached the woman with cautious concern. "Need some help?" he called out over the rain. The woman turned to him, her expression a mix of relief and embarrassment. "Yes," she said, her voice trembling. "The car won't start. I think it's the battery, but I'm not sure." Jake nodded, his mechanic instincts kicking in. "Pop the hood," he said simply. The woman fumbled for the latch, and Jake leaned over the engine, assessing the situation. Sure enough, it was just a dead battery, nothing he couldn't handle. "I can jumpstart it with my truck," he said. "It'll just take a minute." The woman nodded, wrapping her arms around herself as the rain continued to pour. Jake worked quickly, attaching the jumper cables and starting his truck. Within moments, the car's engine roared back to life. "There you go," Jake said, stepping back and giving her a small smile. The woman's gratitude was palpable. She thanked him repeatedly, her voice thick with relief. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, reaching for her purse. "Can I pay you? Please. Let me do something." Jake shook his head. "Don't worry about it," he said. "Just pay it forward someday." The woman paused, her eyes searching his face as though trying to memorize the moment. "I will," she said softly. "I promise." She introduced herself as Emily, and for a brief moment, they stood there in the rain, two strangers connected by an act of kindness. Jake didn't think much of it at the time. He'd done what he always did, helped where he could, expecting nothing in return. As Emily drove off into the night, Jake climbed back into his truck, shaking the rain from his hair. He didn't dwell on the encounter. For him, it was just another moment in a long day. The next 2 days passed uneventfully. Jake returned to his routine at the garage, fixing cars and chatting with customers. Life went on as usual, and the rainy evening with Emily faded into the background of his thoughts. That's why, when his neighbor called him in a panic one morning, Jake was completely caught off guard. "Jake, you need to get home right now," the voice on the other end of the line exclaimed. There's a helicopter in front of your house." Jake frowned, wiping his hands on a rag. "A helicopter," he repeated, incredulous. "Yes, and a bunch of people in suits. They're asking for you." Confusion swirled in Jake's mind as he hung up and grabbed his keys. What on earth was going on? He drove home as quickly as he could, his thoughts racing. When he turned onto his street, Jake was greeted by a sight that didn't feel real. There, parked on the lawn of his modest house, was a sleek helicopter. A group of well-dressed people stood nearby, their umbrellas shielding them from the drizzle. Jake parked his truck and approached cautiously. His heart pounded, and he had no idea what to expect. One of the men stepped forward, offering a polite smile. "Mr. Harrison?" he asked. Jake nodded slowly. "We're here on behalf of someone you helped 2 days ago," the man continued. "Emily." The name jolted Jake's memory. "The woman in the rain. She wanted us to deliver a message," the man said, handing Jake an envelope. Jake took it with shaking hands, his mind spinning. He opened the envelope carefully, pulling out a letter. The words were simple but left him speechless. "Thank you for your kindness. It meant more than you know. Please come with us." Jake stared at the letter, his heart racing. A helicopter, a group of strangers, and a mysterious message, all because he had stopped to help someone in the rain. "Sir," the man prompted gently, "are you ready to come with us?" Jake hesitated for a moment, still trying to make sense of everything. But curiosity won out. He nodded, following the man toward the helicopter, unsure of where this strange new path would lead. Jake stepped into the helicopter, the soft hum of its engines vibrating through the floor. It was surreal. Just 2 days ago, he'd been fixing Emily's car on a rainy roadside, and now he was being whisked away by a team of suited professionals. As the helicopter lifted off, Jake couldn't help but glance back at his small home, its chipped paint and weathered shingles looking even more modest from above. The ride was quiet, the only sound the rhythmic thrum of the rotor blades. Jake stared out the window, watching the familiar streets of Springfield fade into the distance. He wanted to ask questions, to demand answers, but the words caught in his throat. Part of him was overwhelmed by the sheer absurdity of the situation. After about 20 minutes, the helicopter began its descent. Jake's jaw dropped as the estate came into view. It was enormous, a sprawling mansion surrounded by perfectly manicured gardens, fountains glistening in the light drizzle. The sheer scale of it made Jake feel out of place, his calloused hands and oil-stained jeans a stark contrast to the grandeur. The helicopter touched down smoothly, and one of the men gestured for Jake to follow. They walked across the immaculately trimmed lawn, past marble statues and rows of blooming flowers. Jake could hardly process the opulence around him. They entered the mansion through a set of towering double doors. Inside, the ceilings stretched high above, and every surface gleamed with polished marble and gold accents. Jake felt like he'd stepped into a different world, one he had no business being in. "Right this way," one of the men said, leading Jake through a series of hallways until they arrived at a large room with floor-to-ceiling windows. The view overlooked the estate's gardens, where rows of rose bushes and neatly trimmed hedges created a serene, almost magical landscape. Standing by the window was Emily. She turned as Jake entered, a warm but composed smile spreading across her face. This wasn't the drenched, vulnerable woman he had met on the roadside. Today, she stood tall and elegant, her tailored dress accentuating her air of confidence. "Jake," she said, her voice calm but carrying an undertone of genuine warmth. "Thank you for coming." Jake took a hesitant step forward, his confusion written plainly across his face. "Emily, what is all this?" he asked. "Why the helicopter? Why am I here?" Emily gestured for him to sit in one of the plush chairs arranged by the window. "Please, make yourself comfortable," she said. Jake hesitated but eventually sat, his hands resting awkwardly on his knees. Emily took a seat across from him, her expression softening. "I wanted to thank you, Jake," she began. "What you did for me that day, stopping to help. Expecting nothing in return, it meant more than you know." Jake shrugged, still feeling out of place. "It wasn't a big deal," he said. "Just a dead battery. Anyone would have done the same." Emily's gaze grew more intense. That's where you're wrong, she said. That night, dozens of cars passed me by. You were the only one who stopped. She paused, as if choosing her words carefully. You see, Jake, I'm not just Emily. I'm Emily Carter. My family owns this estate. And we have more resources than most people could ever imagine. But that night, none of that mattered. I was just a woman stranded in the rain. And you were the one who helped me. Jake shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I didn't do it for any kind of reward, he said. I just thought you needed help. I know, Emily said, her smile returning. That's what makes it so remarkable. There was a moment of silence before Emily continued. Jake, your kindness reminded me of something I had forgotten, that the simplest acts of humanity can have the greatest impact. And I wanted to repay you in a way that reflects how much that moment meant to me. She stood and walked over to a small table, where an envelope and a set of keys were neatly arranged. Picking them up, she returned to Jake and handed them to him. These, she said, her voice steady, represent my gratitude. Inside the envelope is a check, enough money for you to live comfortably for the rest of your life. The keys are to a new car waiting outside. Far better than the one you're driving now. Jake stared at the envelope and keys, his hands trembling. I don't know what to say, he stammered. Emily's expression softened. There's more, she said. I also want to offer you a position working with me. I see someone with not only skills but also heart. It's rare, Jake. And I think you could bring something truly valuable to my team. Jake's mind reeled. The money, the car, the job, it was more than he could comprehend. He looked up at Emily, his voice barely above a whisper. Why are you doing this for me? Because you didn't hesitate to help me, she said simply. And because people like you deserve to be recognized. Jake sat back in his chair, overwhelmed. He needed time to think, to process everything. Emily seemed to understand. Take your time, she said gently. The offer stands whenever you're ready. Jake left the mansion with the envelope and keys in hand, his thoughts a whirlwind. As the helicopter carried him back to his small home, he couldn't help but wonder how a single act of kindness had brought him here. Back at home, Jake sat in his modest living room, the envelope and keys resting on the table in front of him. He stared at them for what felt like hours, his thoughts tangled in a web of disbelief, gratitude, and uncertainty. The check inside the envelope contained an amount so large that he'd had to reread it several times. Certain he must have made a mistake. It was enough to pay off all his debts, fix up his small house, and ensure he'd never have to worry about money again. But it wasn't just the money or the car. It was the offer of something more, a job, a chance to be part of Emily's world, a world so far removed from his own that it felt like stepping into a dream. Jake spent the next few days trying to return to his routine. But everything felt different now. At the garage, he found himself distracted, his hands moving mechanically as he worked on engines. Customers came and went, their faces familiar, their needs predictable. But Jake's mind was elsewhere. The thought of Emily's offer loomed large, a fork in the road he hadn't expected to encounter. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and cast a warm, golden light across his front yard, Jake sat on his porch with a beer in hand. The envelope sat unopened on the small table beside him. He had resisted spending the money, not because he didn't need it, but because he wasn't sure he was ready to accept what it represented, a complete change in his life. The sound of his neighbor's kids playing in the distance brought a small smile to his face. This was the world he knew, simple, predictable, and rooted in hard work. But was it enough? The thought lingered like a whisper at the back of his mind. Later that night, Jake finally opened the envelope again. Along with the check, there was a handwritten note from Emily. The words were straightforward but carried a depth of sincerity. Jake, thank you again for what you did for me that night. Your kindness was a reminder of what truly matters in life. This is my way of saying thank you. But it's also an invitation to step into something new. The choice is yours. And whatever you decide, know that you've made a difference in my life. The words resonated deeply. Jake had spent his whole life working hard, fixing what was broken, and doing what needed to be done. But Emily's words reminded him that sometimes, stepping into the unknown could be just as meaningful as staying the course. The next morning, Jake made his decision. He called the number Emily had given him, his voice steady despite the butterflies in his stomach. "Emily," he said when she answered, "I've thought about it. I'd like to accept your offer." Emily's warmth was audible through the phone. "I'm so glad to hear that, Jake. You won't regret this." 2 days later, the helicopter returned, landing once again on Jake's front lawn. This time, as he climbed aboard, he felt a sense of clarity and anticipation rather than confusion. When they arrived at the estate, Emily greeted him with her characteristic grace. But there was a new energy in her demeanor, an excitement about what lay ahead. She showed Jake to his new office, a space outfitted with everything he would need to oversee a special project she had in mind. "You'll be helping me with community outreach programs," Emily explained. "We focus on helping people who've been overlooked, people like me that night, stranded in the rain. Your skills and empathy make you perfect for this role." Jake was floored by the thoughtfulness behind the offer. It wasn't just a job, it was a way to channel his experiences and values into something meaningful. The days that followed were a whirlwind. Jake found himself learning new skills, meeting people from all walks of life, and discovering a side of himself he hadn't known existed. For the first time in years, he felt like his work wasn't just about fixing things but about building something lasting. One evening, as he stood on the balcony of the estate, watching the sunset over the gardens, Jake reflected on how far he'd come. What had started as a simple act of kindness had blossomed into an opportunity to change not only his own life but the lives of countless others. And in that quiet moment, he understood the lesson Emily had been trying to share: kindness, no matter how small, can ripple outward in ways we can never predict, creating a legacy far greater than we ever imagined. As the months went by, Jake fully embraced his new role. Working alongside Emily, he helped launch programs that provided aid to those in need: stranded motorists, struggling families, and individuals overlooked by society. For the first time, Jake felt that his efforts were building a better future, not just for himself, but for others. His transformation became a testament to the power of compassion. What had started as a small act of kindness, a simple roadside gesture, had grown into something much larger. Jake's humility and empathy inspired those around him, proving that even the smallest actions could lead to extraordinary outcomes. One evening, as Jake stood on the estate balcony watching the sun set over the gardens, he reflected on how much his life had changed. The old worries about bills and long hours were gone, replaced by a sense of purpose and fulfillment. The lesson was clear: kindness creates ripples that can touch lives in ways we may never see. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe to Life Stories for more tales of inspiration and hope. Let us know in the comments how Jake's journey resonated with you. Sometimes, the simplest gestures truly make the biggest difference.